Hello everybody and welcome back to the Best Ride in Planet Coaster Tournament! So, I need to apologize. As it turns out, the queue time does in fact matter for more rides than just the Zozo. Here's the clip of me finding this out. It's looking like Overpowered did take the lead there near the end, and is gonna win this one. There's 10 more guests left and it doesn't matter. No matter which queue line they get in, Overpowered's still gonna win it. And it's gonna be a round one victory for Overpowered. Let me just look at this real quick because I know people are also mentioning, yeah. Son of a bitch! That's right, there are a few other rides that guests will complain about queue times for. I always thought if this was a problem, it would appear in the guests' thoughts on the ride info. That isn't always the case though, and you need to look at the guests' thoughts about the park. So what does this mean? Well, in order to make things fair for all the rides, I have to redo all the matches. Luckily, I figured out what exactly I did to make the queue wait time 0 minutes, so now every match will be as fair as possible. Here's how it works. So the first thing you need to do is open the park and let some guests on each ride. I set the park limit to 10 for this so the rides don't get swarmed. After they get on the ride and it starts to move, the queue time should go from a dash to a few minutes. Once they get off the ride, make it so the guests get stuck in the queue line again by getting rid of the minimum wait time. Again, let some guests on each ride. Once they get to the front of the line, let them on the ride by checking the minimum wait time again. This time, when the ride starts moving, the queue times will instantly become 0. Then you save and load the file. Congrats! You've just temporarily frozen your queue time to 0 minutes. This really only works for the tournament. If you're trying to do this on your own save file, it's not going to end up working well for you. If the ride is closed or you start letting people actually on the ride, the queue time will come back. With all that being said, let's get into the rematches so we can finally move on with a fair and accurate tournament. Match 1, Gears of Fear vs. Forge. Now, if you remember the first time we did this, Forge won 2-0. Each match, though, was super close. And, turns out, if their queue lines are both set to 0, the matches get even closer. They were so close, in fact, I had no choice but to run these rides because they were pretty much dead even. And the final results also showed that they were almost dead even. Now, since we did let guests ride these rides in order to get the queue lines to be frozen at 0, I did have to write down how many guests were on those rides, setting them to 0. So for Gears, it started at 9, and for Forge, it started at 3. After I ran the ride, 500 total guests, Gears ended up with 262 guests, while Forge ended up with 250. Now you do the subtraction, you take those 9 original guests away from Gears, you end up with 253, and if you take those 3 away from Forge, you end up with 247. 253 plus 247 equals the 500 total guests, and Gears of Fear wins round 1 by 6 guests. However, round 2 was a different story. Both queue lines again were super close, so they needed to be tested. A total of 500 guests had entered the park, and after the rides were run, Gears of Fear had 248, while Forge ended up with 264. After subtracting the guests that got on the ride during the setting of the queues to 0, Gears ended up with 239, while Forge had 261. Add those two numbers up equals 500. So Forge takes round 2 by a much bigger margin than Gears did in round 1. So, since each of these rides took a round, we now go to the tiebreaker, round 3. This time the queue line looked like Gears had the lead, but since these rounds were so close, I decided just to run them anyway. With a total of 501 guests, after the math was done on each of these rides, Gears of Fear ended up with 277 guests, while Forge had 224. Meaning, Gears wins round 3 and moves on in the tournament. Like I said at the start, the first time we did this match, the rounds were super close. So this whole queue line issue could have definitely played a role in having forged 2-0 Gears. So now that everything is on fair terms, even ground, Gears wins it and moves on. And now we move on to match 2, Rocktopus vs Hammerswing, and this one was interesting. For round 1, we only got 459 guests in the park before they stopped showing up, so that is our base number to work off of. Rocktopus had 4 guests ride it during the setting of the queue lines to 0, while Hammerswing had 8. Looking at these queue lines, it looks like there's a winner, but because I just couldn't believe it, I ran the rides anyway. After the math was done, Rocktopus ended up with 243 guests, while Hammerswing had 216, meaning Rocktopus wins round 1. If you think that's crazy, just wait till round 2, because round 2 was essentially the same exact results. This time we only had 455 guests in the park, 4 less guests than round 1. After the math was all said and done, Rocktopus had 241 guests, while Hammerswing had 214. That's right. 4 less guests in round 1. Each of those rides had 2 less guests ride them. The same exact results, which also means Rocktopus wins round 2, and Rocktopus moves on in the tournament, 2-0ing Hammerswing. So Rocktopus is one of those rides like the Zozo, where the guests want to ride it, but they don't feel like waiting for it, which is why Hammerswing probably 2-0'd it in the first time we did this. And since we got rid of that feature to make the rides more fair, Rocktopus actually won it. Now at this point, I bet you some of you are like, Toad, you're such an idiot. If you had only done this from the start, everything would be fine right now. But now everything is different. Well, you're wrong. From here on out, all the results of the previous matches ended up being the same exact results. And to prove it to you, we're going to go through all of it. Round 3, kickflip versus overpower. Now, I forgot to hit record on round 1, but I did write the numbers down. So we ended up with 502 guests in the park, and after I did the math, kickflip got 235 of the guests, while overpowered got 267, meaning overpowered wins round 1. For round 2, there was no point in running the rides because overpowered just annihilates kickflip and wins round 2 to move on in the tournament. Next we have match 4, Iron Claw versus the Cube. In round 1, we see Iron Claw win by a landslide against the Cube. Then in round 2, we see Iron Claw win by a landslide against the Cube. Iron Claw ends up 2-0ing the Cube again and moves on in the tournament. Next match, match 5, we have Magic Twirl versus the Aeronauts. Round 1. This one was closer than the previous matches. The Aeronauts does win out, though, with a longer queue line. Again, so much of a difference, we did not need to run the rides. Same story with round 2. Aeronauts ended up winning out with a longer queue line and 2-0ing Magic Twirl to move on in the tournament. Next we have match 6, Tristorm vs Collider. Now with the queue line set to 0, I thought this match was going to be another one that ended up really close. I think the opposite happened, and I'm pretty sure Tristorm won by more this time. Round 1, Tristorm won by a margin, and then round 2, Tristorm won by a margin. Again, Tristorm 2-0s Collider and moves on in the tournament. On to match 7, we have Hyperspin versus Big Wheel. And again, you think switching these queue line times to 0 would, maybe even some things out? I think in some cases it does actually make the one ride even more favorable, because if that one queue line was pretty long and the guests were like, oh no, I don't want to go on that one, and they go to the crappier ride, since that restriction is lifted, those guests are going to end up on the queue line they wanted to go in. And I think this is one of those instances that proves it because I'm pretty sure Magic Twirl won by more in round 1 and in round 2 to beat Big Wheel again 2-0. And again, Hyperspin moves on in the tournament. Match 8, Psychola versus Wild Blue. Another one I thought was going to end up closer. Round 1, Psychola wins by a margin. Round 2, Psychola ends up winning by a landslide. Psychola 2-0s Wild Blue and moves on in the tournament. Match 9, Insanity versus Looper. Now, I bet you can, you guys are smart people. You can figure out how this one ends up. No amount of 0 queue time was gonna let Looper move on in this tournament. Looper is just way too insane of a ride, and Insanity ends up winning both rounds by a landslide, 2-0ing Looper again, flushing it right down the pooper, and Insanity moves on in the tournament. And then we have the final rematch, Genie vs. Pathos 3, match 10. Another one I thought might end up being closer, ends up not being the case. Genie wins round 1 by a margin, and then Genie wins round 2 by a margin, 2-0ing Pathos 3, and moving on in the tournament. Now at this point you might be saying, well, what about the 3 matches that you did last episode? Well, don't worry about that, because I will be redoing those completely in the next video. Since we have Gears of Fear moving on and Rocktopus, 2 new rides moving on, I might as well just redo those along with the Scissor and Coriolis in that video as well. And that solves that. So, everything is now caught back up. You guys are caught back up. We only had 2 rides get in that should have been in. Gears of Fear and Rocktopus. Of course, the first 2 matches, so it's interesting how that one happened. But yeah, everything now is as even as it can be. The prices are set to free, so guests aren't going to be concerned about pricing when picking a ride. Queue times are now set to 0, so guests aren't going to be concerned about waiting in a line when it comes to picking these rides. The only thing the guests are now concerned about when it comes to picking which ride to ride on is how good the ride is, which is exactly what I wanted this tournament to be all along. So with that, next episode we'll see Sunflare versus Gears of Fear, Scissor versus Coriolis, and Zozo versus Rocktopus. Thank you all for watching. Leave a like and share the video if you enjoyed. That helped it a lot. Subscribe if you want to see more, and I'll see you next time.